Breaking news from Munich. Last week, the regional court in Munich ruled that embedding Google fonts violates the GDPR. This is the second case that we've seen in recent weeks, specifically around Google and the GDPR, and is part of a large suite of suits that has been made against Google starting in 2020, moving in, and finally we're starting to see some of these rulings come in. So that's what we're going to be talking about, as well as the future of Google on this week's episode of the BB&J podcast. I'm your host, as almost always, John Lind, and let's get into it. So what is Google Fonts to start with, right? Google Fonts is a suite of fonts that exists in a library through Google, and developers can embed it into their desktop and or mobile sites and then access it. So let's say I want to use a fancy font. Rather than having to store all of those characters on my local server, or just use what's considered web-safe fonts, which are fonts that can be read by anything. It's just like hard-coded in HTML5. I can just access Google Fonts and use that stuff, not have to worry about it. But the reason that it was determined to have violated GDPR by this German court was that it is being done without the express consent of the users. And this is what really GDPR comes down to. That's why you see, like, okay, we use cookies except to keep using the site. That's why you see anything of their handling of your data. If you are an EU citizen, and in practice they use it for everybody, because it's the nature of regulation, you need to get the consent of the user. It could be a huge wall of text and then accept at the bottom, but still they need to be consenting to it. And Google Fonts uses the user's IP information to deliver that font to them, and that was determined to violate the GDPR. Now, what does this mean for the future of Google, right? Because these are two rulings, and unless you're in marketing or you have a business, you probably don't think a ton about Google Analytics. Unless you're a web developer or a web designer, you probably don't think that much about Google Fonts. But here's the thing. These things affect pretty much every single site, right? If a site uses Google Fonts, if a plugin for a website, which, a lot of times if you're using a website builder, there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the background that you don't even necessarily know about as the user of the site builder. You could see those plugins needed to be updated so that they work with the new, however the Google's going to restructure its system. Or you might see, your Google Analytics stop working or stop working as well. And, as I mentioned with Google Analytics specifically, you could see kind of what happened with Facebook, where it became much harder to target people effectively through the traditional ways that we have been. And you're going to have to, the simple answer is you're going to have to rely on content. Moving forward, the thing I'll say to focus on as a creator, as a business, whatever it is focus on content. Don't stop running ads, but the cost to reach people through Google is probably going to go up moving forward. As a user of Google, make sure that you stay up to date. Make sure that you check in on these EU rulings, because you'll see different aspects of Google, different programs, different functions, different services being hit with different regulatory rulings, right? Different ruled illegal. This thing was ruled illegal. And from what we're seeing, it'll all specifically be around the GDPR, which for those of you who don't know, the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a regulation in EU law on data protection and privacy in the European Union and European Economic Area. In practice, this affects the whole world, and if you have a website, it needs to be GDPR compliant. If you are using the people's who visit your site's data in any way, shape, or form, you need to be GDPR compliant, because that's just the nature of how these regulations work. Like I said, I will make sure to keep you updated. You know, we're going to expect a lot of changes moving forward with the EU, with GDPR, with how Google handles data. So the best thing I can recommend is keep watching this podcast, because I'm looking out for this stuff, and I'll definitely let you know when it comes up. Other than that, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and or watching. If there's a marketing adjacent, tech related news story that you'd like me to cover, please drop a comment. You know, you can go to bbdigitallab.com/podcast, leave a comment there. If you know me in person, tell me in person. I'd love to talk about it. But other than that, I'll see you next week.